The night was supposed to be routine, a quiet patrol through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago. But as Officer Danny Monroe and his loyal K-9 partner, Coda, stepped into the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, routine turned into chaos. Gunfire erupted, a desperate fight for survival unfolded, and when the dust settled, Danny lay on the brink of death, Coda's pained growls echoing through the stillness. But what happened next would defy logic and leave even the doctors stunned, a moment so powerful it would redefine the bond between man and dog and prove that true loyalty knows no limits. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any exciting stories like this one. Here, each video is a journey of overcoming an emotion that you won't want to miss. The rain poured relentlessly over Chicago's South Side, turning cracked sidewalks into rivers of filth. Officer Danny Monroe adjusted the windshield wipers of his patrol SUV, glancing at his partner, Coda, a fierce but disciplined German shepherd. Coda sat alert, ears twitching with every sound beyond the windows. "Another long night ahead, huh, boy?" Danny said, scratching behind Coda's ear. The dog tilted his head, his tongue briefly flicking out as if to respond. Danny smiled, though a tension lingered in the pit of his stomach. The pair had been patrolling together for 3 years, forming a bond most people could only dream of. A dispatch crackled over the radio. "All units, report of suspicious activity at 432 Westfield Avenue, abandoned property. Possible gang presence. Proceed with caution." Danny sighed, gripping the wheel. Westfield Avenue wasn't just any address, it was a known hotspot for illegal arms deals. He nodded at Coda, as if to reassure himself. "Looks like we're up." Coda barked softly, as if in agreement. They arrived at the address just after midnight. The house loomed like a shadow, its broken windows and sagging porch a testament to years of neglect. Danny parked a block away, killing the lights and stepping into the rain with Coda at his side. The faint smell of gun oil hit him first, a warning sign he had learned not to ignore. "Stay close, boy," he whispered, drawing his flashlight and service weapon. Coda's nose quivered, his body tense as they approached the front door, which hung ajar. Danny pushed it open slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was worse than the exterior, rotting floorboards, graffiti-covered walls, and a thick stench of mildew. Coda sniffed the air, then let out a low growl. Danny froze. "What is it?" Before he could react, a shout erupted from the shadows. "It's the cops. Take 'em out." Gunfire tore through the air. Danny dove for cover, returning fire as bullets splintered the doorframe behind him. Coda sprang into action, lunging at a figure who had stepped into the dim light. The dog's powerful jaws clamped onto the man's arm, forcing him to drop his weapon with a howl of pain. Another shot rang out. Danny felt the searing heat of a bullet tearing into his side, then another striking his chest plate. He fell backward, gasping for air as his vision blurred. Coda was still fighting, his growls and the screams of the man he subdued echoing through the chaos. "Hold on, Coda," Danny wheezed, but his voice barely escaped his lips. His strength was fading fast. The last thing he saw before blacking out was Coda standing over him, snarling at a shadowed figure raising a crowbar. Then came the sickening crack of metal on bone, and silence. Danny's world faded into darkness, his body heavy and motionless as the sound of rain mingled with muffled voices. Somewhere nearby, Coda's growls turned into whimpers, then silence. The faint scent of iron, the unmistakable smell of blood, filled the air. "Officer down. We've got an officer down and a K-9 injured," shouted a voice, distant but frantic. Danny's mind stirred briefly, like a flickering light in a storm, before slipping back into unconsciousness. At the hospital, chaos reigned as paramedics burst through the emergency room doors. Danny's blood-soaked uniform told the story of his harrowing ordeal. His pulse was faint, his skin pale, but he was alive, barely. Koda had been rushed to a nearby veterinary clinic, his injury severe but treatable. In the sterile hospital corridors, a team of trauma surgeons worked furiously to stabilize Danny. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the lead surgeon, frowned as she read his vitals. 2 gunshot wounds. One through the abdomen, the other nicked his lung. Severe blood loss. Let's get him into surgery now, she barked. As they wheeled Danny into the operating room, a piercing sound echoed through the hospital. It was a dog's bark, strong, relentless, and filled with urgency. Even unconscious, Danny's fingers twitched, his breathing shallow but steady. The sound faded as the surgical team began their delicate work. Meanwhile, at the veterinary clinic, Koda was lying on a table, his fur matted with blood from a deep gash across his shoulder. Dr. Anthony Morales and his assistants worked swiftly, cleaning the wound and suturing it with precision. Despite his injuries, Koda's eyes remained sharp, darting toward every sound. His ears twitched when he heard voices in the hallway, footsteps, commands, and the distant hum of engines. "He's incredible," said one assistant, glancing at Koda's tense expression. "Even after all that, he's still alert." Dr. Morales nodded. "Dogs like him don't give up easily. Let's make sure he has the chance to fight." Koda let out a low, determined growl, as if he understood. Hours later, Danny lay in the intensive care unit, his body hooked up to machines that monitored his fragile condition. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms, the room eerily quiet except for the soft beeping of his heart monitor. The nurses whispered outside, their words heavy with doubt. "He lost so much blood. It's a miracle he's even alive. If he doesn't wake up soon." But none of them finished the thought. At that moment, a commotion erupted down the hall. Koda, now patched up and discharged from the veterinary clinic, had been brought to the hospital. His handler, Sergeant Green, tried to keep him calm, but the dog tugged against the leash with a force that belied his injuries. "I don't think this is a good idea," said a nurse, blocking the entrance to Danny's room. "Koda's not just his partner," Green argued. "Let him in. You'd be surprised what these dogs can do." Reluctantly, the nurse stepped aside, and Koda bolted into the room. He leapt onto the floor beside Danny's bed, his ears perking up as he sniffed the air. For a moment, the dog hesitated, his large brown eyes scanning his partner's pale face. Then, with a deep bark, Koda began to nudge Danny's hand, first gently, then with growing insistence. "Easy, Koda," Green said softly, though he made no move to stop the dog. Koda barked again, this time louder. His paw rested on Danny's arm as he let out a low, mournful whine. The nurses exchanged skeptical looks until one of them gasped. Danny's hand moved. It was barely perceptible, but it was enough to draw everyone's attention. A groan escaped his lips, weak and hoarse, as his eyelids fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused, but he turned his head slightly toward the sound of Koda's barking. "Koda." Danny's voice was a raspy whisper, but it sent a wave of astonishment through the room. One nurse rushed to check his vitals. His heart rate just stabilized. "This is unbelievable." Koda wagged his tail, leaning closer to Danny as if willing him to stay awake. Danny's hand, trembling, reached toward the dog's fur. The room fell silent as the two partners connected once more, their bond unbroken despite the horrors of the night. Dr. Carter entered the room, her face a mixture of disbelief and awe. "I've seen a lot in this hospital," she said, "but I've never seen anything like this." Danny's recovery was a delicate balance between medical expertise and sheer willpower. For days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, tethered to life by machines and the tireless efforts of the hospital staff. But there was one constant in his waking moments: Koda. The dog refused to leave Danny's side, his large frame a steady, comforting presence. It was late afternoon when Danny stirred more fully than before. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft patterns across the sterile walls. He opened his eyes to find Coda lying at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his paws. The moment Danny moved, Coda's ears perked up, and his tail thumped against the floor. "You're still here, boy," Danny croaked, his voice rough from days without speaking. Coda let out a low, joyful bark, his body rising as if to reassure Danny. A nurse who had been checking his fur turned toward him with a wide smile. "Well, you're finally awake," she said. "That dog hasn't budged. I think he's been waiting for you." Danny managed a weak smile. "He's a stubborn one." The nurse adjusted his bed so he could sit up slightly. "Dr. Carter will be thrilled to see this progress. You've had quite a fight on your hands." Danny's mind was foggy, the events of that night coming back in flashes. The gunfire. The pain. Coda's growls and then, darkness. "Coda, is he okay?" The nurse glanced at the dog, her smile softening. "He's recovering well. Took some injuries, but nothing he couldn't handle. I think he's more worried about you than himself." Danny reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against Coda's fur. The dog leaned into the touch, a deep rumble of contentment vibrating in his chest. "Good boy," Danny murmured. "You saved me out there." As the days passed, Danny's strength began to return. His recovery was slow and grueling, each movement a reminder of the damage he'd endured. But Coda was a constant motivator, his bright eyes and wagging tail pushing Danny to fight harder. One afternoon, Sergeant Green stopped by with updates from the precinct. He placed a folder on the bedside table, his expression grave. "We got one of the guys who ambushed you," Green said. "The others are still out there, but we're closing in." Danny's jaw tightened. "They won't stop until they're caught." Green nodded. "We've increased patrols in the area, but you need to focus on healing. Let us handle the rest." Danny's gaze drifted to Coda, who had been lying quietly but now stood, his nose twitching toward the folder as if sensing its importance. "I won't feel right until we finish this, Green," Danny said. "Coda and we don't leave things unfinished." Green placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than enough. Get better first. We'll need you and Coda back in top form when the time comes." That night, Danny struggled to sleep. The hospital room was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He kept replaying the moment he fell, the sharp pain in his side, and the sound of Coda's growls fading into silence. Coda, as if sensing his turmoil, climbed onto the bed, his warm presence a grounding force. Danny let his hand rest on the dog's back, drawing strength from the bond they shared. "We're gonna get through this," Danny whispered. "Both of us." Coda's soft whine was his only response, but it was enough. Danny's progress continued steadily, but each day brought new challenges. Physical therapy was grueling, his body resisted the exercises meant to rebuild his strength. The pain was sharp and persistent, a reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything. Still, Coda was his ever-present shadow, nudging him forward whenever he faltered. It was during one particularly difficult session that Danny felt his resolve waver. The therapist, a patient but firm man named Eric, encouraged him to take another step forward. Danny clenched his jaw, beads of sweat rolling down his face. "You've got this, Monroe," Eric said, his voice steady. "One more step." Danny gritted his teeth but faltered, the pain in his abdomen flaring up. He cursed under his breath, gripping the bars of the parallel walker tightly. Coda, who had been sitting obediently nearby, suddenly stood and barked. It wasn't loud or alarming, but it was enough to catch Danny's attention. The dog stepped closer, his expressive eyes locking with Danny's. All right, Danny muttered. "I hear you, boy." Summoning his last bit of strength, he forced himself to take another step. Then another. Coda's tail wagged furiously, and Eric nodded with approval. "That's what I'm talking about. Keep it up." By the end of the session, Danny was exhausted but victorious. As he sat on a bench, catching his breath, Kota leaned against him, offering silent support. "You're the reason I keep pushing, you know that?" Danny said, scratching behind Kota's ears. The dog responded with a soft, satisfied huff. Back at the hospital room, Danny's mood lifted when he saw Sergeant Green waiting for him. The sergeant had brought coffee and updates from the precinct. "Good to see you up and moving," Green said, handing him the cup. "How's our star K9 doing?" Kota barked, tail wagging as if answering for himself. "Better than me," Danny replied with a smirk. "What's the news?" Green's expression turned serious. "We've tracked the rest of the gang. They're laying low, but we think they're planning to leave the city soon. If that happens, we might lose them for good." Danny sat up straighter, the ache in his body forgotten for a moment. "You need backup?" Green held up a hand. "You're not ready, Monroe. Focus on healing. We've got this." Danny's jaw tightened, but he knew Green was right. As much as he wanted to be out there, his body wasn't ready for another fight. "Just promise me you'll keep Kota out of it until I'm back," Danny said, his voice firm. Green nodded. "He's your partner. We'll respect that." That evening, Danny found himself staring out the hospital window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Kota lay on the floor beside him, his ears twitching at the occasional sound from the hallway. Danny's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that the gang wouldn't simply disappear. If they were desperate enough, they might try something bold and dangerous. He turned to Kota, who looked up at him with unwavering loyalty. "We're not done with this, are we?" Danny murmured. Kota tilted his head, as if agreeing. Suddenly, Danny's phone buzzed on the bedside table. It was Green. "Monroe," the sergeant's voice was low and urgent, "we've got a situation. The gang just hit a warehouse on the west side. They're heavily armed and moving fast." Danny's heart pounded. He glanced at Kota, who was already standing, his body tense. "Send me the details," Danny said, determination flaring in his voice. "We're coming." Danny barely hesitated after ending the call with Green. His body screamed in protest as he swung his legs off the bed, but his resolve was unshakable. Kota stood beside him, tail wagging slightly, as if sensing the importance of the moment. "You ready for this, partner?" Danny asked, wincing as he reached for his clothes. Kota let out a sharp bark, his eyes never leaving Danny. With a mix of determination and stubbornness, Danny dressed and strapped on his gear, ignoring the dull ache in his side. The nurses protested when they saw him leaving his room, but he brushed them off with a wave. "This can't wait," he said, his voice firm. By the time Danny and Kota arrived at the West Side warehouse, chaos was in full swing. Police cruisers surrounded the area, their lights casting flashing red and blue streaks across the darkened streets. Officers huddled behind vehicles, weapons drawn, as sporadic gunfire echoed from inside the building. Green was the first to spot Danny stepping out of the unmarked car he had commandeered. The sergeant's face was a mix of relief and exasperation. "Monroe. You're supposed to be in a hospital bed," he yelled over the din, rushing to meet him. Danny shrugged, motioning toward Kota. "We're not sitting this one out." "What's the situation?" Green sighed but relented. "The gang's barricaded inside with a stash of weapons. We've got snipers covering the exits, but they're not going down without a fight." Danny nodded, his gaze shifting to the building. "Kota and I can get in there. He'll sniff them out." "No way," Green shot back. "You're not fit for this, and Kota's still recovering too." Danny stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, they know how we operate. If we keep waiting, they'll either dig in or start taking us down one by one. Let us go in. Kota's the best shot we've got to flush them out." Green hesitated, the weight of the decision clear in his expression. Finally, he relented. "You've got 10 minutes. Don't push it." Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with dust and tension. Danny moved slowly, his side burning with every step, while Coda prowled ahead, his nose to the ground. The dog's movements were precise, every muscle coiled with anticipation. A sharp bark broke the silence, and Coda froze, his body rigid as he pointed toward a stack of crates. Danny raised his weapon, his finger steady on the trigger. "Come out," he shouted. "This is the Chicago PD. You're surrounded." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a figure darted from the shadows, a rifle raised. Coda lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's arm before he could fire. The gun clattered to the ground as the man screamed, and Danny moved in, securing him with handcuffs. "Good boy," Danny muttered, giving Coda a quick pat before they continued deeper into the warehouse. As they cleared room after room, the danger escalated. Another gang member ambushed them from behind a stack of pallets, firing wildly. Danny ducked, the shots narrowly missing him, but Coda charged forward, his powerful jaws snapping at the assailant's leg. The man fell, and Danny disarmed him swiftly. The last remaining gang members were holed up in an office at the back of the warehouse. Danny and Coda approached cautiously, the sound of desperate voices carrying through the thin walls. "They're coming for us, man. We've got to make a break for it." "No way. We fight till the end." Danny exchanged a glance with Coda, his lips pressing into a thin line. He signaled for the dog to stay low, then kicked the door open. The men inside barely had time to react. Coda rushed in, barking ferociously, while Danny trained his weapon on them. "Drop your guns. Now!" Danny barked. For a moment, it seemed like they might resist, but the sight of Coda's bared teeth convinced them otherwise. One by one, they surrendered, dropping their weapons to the floor. Danny exhaled, his grip on the gun relaxing slightly. "It's over." As the officers secured the scene, Green approached Danny with a rare smile. "I've got to hand it to you, Monroe. You and Coda still have it." Danny knelt beside Coda, who wagged his tail despite his exhaustion. "We never lost it." That night, as Danny and Coda returned home, the weight of the mission lifted slightly. Their bond had once again proven unbreakable, forged in fire and danger. The adrenaline of the warehouse raid lingered well into the night, but exhaustion finally caught up with Danny as he and Coda arrived home. Danny eased himself onto the couch, wincing at the sharp ache in his side. Coda sat at his feet, his eyes never straying far from Danny. "You did good today, boy," Danny murmured, leaning down to scratch Coda's neck. The dog huffed softly, leaning into the touch. For a moment, the house was quiet. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of the curtains were the only sounds. Danny closed his eyes, replaying the night's events in his mind. He should have felt victorious, but unease crept in. Something about the gang's desperation didn't sit right. The next morning, Sergeant Green called, his tone serious. "Monroe, we need you at the station," he said. "There's been a development." Danny frowned, sitting up straighter. "What kind of development?" "Just get here. And bring Coda." The unease from the previous night returned in full force. Danny didn't hesitate. He dressed quickly, ignoring the stiffness in his body, and Coda was already by the door, sensing his urgency. At the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Green met Danny in the hallway, holding a thick file. "After the raid, we started digging deeper into the gang's operations," Green explained, leading Danny to the briefing room. "Turns out, they weren't just dealing arms. They've been running surveillance on our department." Danny's stomach dropped. "Surveillance? What do you mean?" Green opened the file, revealing photos, notes, and floor plans. Danny's face appeared in several of the photos, along with images of other officers. There were even detailed sketches of the precinct's layout. "They've been watching us for months," Green continued. "We found this in the warehouse. They knew our patrol routes, our schedules. And they've got connections higher up than we thought." Danny stared at the evidence, his jaw tightening. "They knew we were coming that night." Green nodded grimly. "Exactly. That's why they were so prepared. This isn't over, Monroe. Not by a long shot." As the day wore on, the implications of the gang's surveillance weighed heavily on Danny. Back at home, he sat with Coda, the file spread out on the coffee table. The dog sniffed at one of the photos, then looked up at Danny with a low whine. "I know, buddy," Danny said, rubbing Coda's head. "This changes everything." Danny's phone buzzed. It was Green again. "We've got intel on a safe house," Green said. "It's tied to the gang's higher-ups. We're assembling a team for a raid tomorrow night." Danny's heart raced. He wanted to be part of it, to finish what they'd started, but the lingering pain in his side reminded him of his limitations. "Let me come," Danny said, his voice firm. There was a pause on the line before Green responded. "You sure you're ready for this?" Danny glanced at Coda, who was watching him intently. "We're ready." The rain returned, pounding the streets with a steady rhythm as the raid team gathered at the edge of the industrial district. The safe house loomed ahead, a nondescript brick building nestled between abandoned warehouses. Its plain exterior gave no hint of the danger within, but Danny and Coda knew better. "All right, team," Sergeant Green said, addressing the officers. "We've got intel that the gang's leaders are inside. They're armed and likely to resist. No mistakes tonight." Danny adjusted his vest, wincing as his side protested. Coda sat at his feet, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. The dog seemed more alert than usual, as if sensing the gravity of the mission. Green approached Danny, lowering his voice. "You sure about this, Monroe? You've barely recovered." Danny glanced at Coda, who let out a low bark of anticipation. "We're sure." The team moved in silence, spreading out around the perimeter. Danny and Coda took the rear entrance, a rusted metal door partially obscured by crates. Danny's heart pounded as he tested the handle, finding it locked. He nodded to Coda, who began sniffing the base of the door. A soft growl escaped the dog's throat, a clear signal. "Something's behind this door," Danny whispered into his radio. "Hold position," Green's voice came back. "Backup's on the way." But as Danny waited, a faint noise caught his attention, a scraping sound, like furniture being moved. Coda's growl deepened, his body tense. Danny made a split-second decision. "We're going in," he muttered. He pulled a lock-picking tool from his pocket, his hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Within seconds, the lock gave way. Danny pushed the door open slowly, his gun raised. The room was dimly lit, stacks of crates and metal shelves casting long shadows. The smell of gun oil was overpowering. Coda advanced cautiously, his nose low to the ground. Danny followed, his eyes darting to every corner. Suddenly, a voice rang out. "Freeze! Don't move." Danny spun, his weapon trained on a man stepping out from behind a stack of crates. He was older, his face scarred, and his eyes cold. "You're a persistent one, officer," the man said, his tone mocking. "You should have stayed in the hospital." Before Danny could respond, another figure emerged from the shadows, this one holding a weapon aimed directly at him. Coda reacted first. With a fierce bark, the dog lunged at the armed man, knocking him off balance. The gun went off, the shot ricocheting harmlessly off a steel beam. Danny took the opportunity to disarm the other man, a quick elbow strike sending the weapon clattering to the ground. But the noise had drawn attention. Footsteps thundered overhead as reinforcements scrambled. Danny grabbed his radio. "We're compromised. Need backup now." Coda was still wrestling with the first man, his powerful jaws clamped onto the assailant's arm. The man screamed, trying in vain to shake the dog off. "Good boy, Coda. Hold him," Danny shouted, covering the door as more gang members poured into the room. The next moments were a blur of gunfire and chaos. Danny and Coda worked in perfect synchronization, the dog incapacitating one attacker after another while Danny provided cover. But the odds were against them, and Danny's injuries slowed him down. A sharp pain erupted in his side as a stray bullet grazed him, sending him to one knee. Coda barked furiously, positioning himself between Danny and the advancing attackers. Despite his own wounds, the dog's determination never wavered. Just as Danny felt his strength fading, the sound of breaking glass filled the air. Green and the backup team stormed in, overwhelming the gang with sheer numbers. The firefight ended as quickly as it had begun. As the dust settled, Danny leaned against a crate, his breathing ragged. Coda limped to his side, his tail wagging weakly. Danny reached out, his hand resting on the dog's head. "You saved me again, boy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Green approached, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. "You're a damn fool, Monroe. But I'll admit, you and Coda got the job done." Danny managed a faint smile. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The precinct buzzed with activity the next morning as Danny and Coda entered, both bandaged but alive. Officers paused their conversations, giving nods of respect to the duo who had risked everything. The raid had been a success, most of the gang's leaders were now in custody, and their weapons stockpile had been confiscated. But Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Green met him at his desk, holding a folder thick with reports from the safe house. "You should be at home resting," Green said, though his tone was lighter than usual. Danny shrugged, sitting down with a wince. "We couldn't stay away." "What've you got?" Green placed the folder on the desk. "It's worse than we thought. These guys weren't just running guns. They were trafficking information, selling intel on cops, officials, even K-9 teams. They had detailed files on us." Danny frowned, flipping through the pages. His stomach dropped when he spotted a photo of himself with Coda, taken outside his own home. "They were watching me," Danny muttered. Green nodded. "They were planning to hit close to home. You and Coda were their primary targets. They knew you'd come after them." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Danny glanced at Coda, who was lying at his feet, his watchful eyes scanning the room. "They underestimated us," Danny said quietly. "But this isn't over, is it?" That evening, Danny sat on his porch, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on him. Coda lay beside him, his head resting on Danny's boot. The scars from their ordeal were fresh, both physical and emotional, but Danny felt a strange sense of peace. "You know," he said, scratching Coda's ear, "there were moments I thought we wouldn't make it out of that warehouse." Coda tilted his head, his expressive eyes meeting Danny's. "But you never gave up," Danny continued. "You kept me going. You always do." Coda let out a soft bark, his tail wagging. Danny chuckled, the sound breaking through the heaviness of the moment. Their quiet was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Green stepped out of his car, a serious expression on his face. "I thought you'd want to hear this in person," Green said, handing Danny a small file. "We got a confession from one of the gang leaders." Danny opened the file, his eyes scanning the typed report. His jaw tightened as he read. "They weren't just targeting me," he said, his voice low. "They were after Coda. They were going to take him." Green nodded. "They wanted to use him for their operations. Dogs like him? Highly valuable to criminals." Danny's fists clenched. The thought of Coda in their hands, used for illegal activities, was unbearable. They didn't get him, Danny said firmly. And they never will. The days that followed were quieter. Danny took time to heal, both physically and mentally, while Coda stayed by his side. Their bond, already strong, deepened with every passing moment. The precinct awarded Coda with a medal for bravery, an honor that brought applause and cheers from the entire department. As Danny pinned the medal to Coda's collar, he knelt beside him, his voice thick with emotion. "This is for you, buddy. You've always been my hero." Coda barked, his tail wagging furiously as if understanding every word. Weeks later, Danny and Coda returned to duty. The scars remained, reminders of their shared journey, but they faced each new challenge with renewed strength. Together, they had proven that their bond was unbreakable, a partnership forged in danger, tested in fire, and strengthened by trust. And as they patrolled the city once more, Danny knew one thing for certain: with Coda by his side, there was nothing they couldn't face. If you liked this story and want more content like this, leave a like, share it with someone you know will be moved by it, and of course, subscribe to the channel. Together, we will explore inspiring stories and moments that touch the heart. Until the next video.